Hello and welcome to Politics Today, and in this programme we shall be discussing a disturbing new survey carried out amongst British university students that reveals 29% support the actions of Hamas on October the 7th. And this shows the extent of the extremism and anti-Semitism we're seeing on our university campuses. And considering that this is the next generation of leaders, indicates that our society and our nation is in trouble, and we'd be asking, what is the British government going to do about it? And in this programme today, I'm joined by Olave Snelling from the Christian Broadcasting Council. Lovely to see you again, Olave. Thank you so much. And Dr Sarah Tun from Prayer for Parliament. And I'll start off with you, Sarah. You and the team do a very important job in terms of going into Parliament, praying for our members of Parliament, as well as ministers of state and our government institutions. Can you just give us a little bit of an update on the important work of Prayer for Parliament?
I think the number one thing we've moved into now in terms of prayer is praying for unity for believers, unity for those that are praying for Parliament, and a strong sense of what does God want us to pray, because things are moving so quickly that our opinions need to stay out of the way and our ambitions need to stay out of the way. We all want the same thing, which is God's will to be done on earth, excuse me, as it is in heaven, and not our will.
Amen. And Olive, always good to see you on the programme.
Thanks.
Just share with us your thoughts on this disturbing new survey that's been commissioned by StandWithUS, conducted by Savanta, and the survey shared exclusively with the Daily Mail. They polled more than 1,000 students across 20 universities campuses in Britain, finding that 29% of students believed that October the 7th was understandable act of resistance. Share your thoughts with these deeply disturbing views held by so many of our university students right across the UK.
It's extremely disturbing, it really is. I mean, we all know about radical students and students being radical, but it's being radical in this particular way. And what is behind that? What is the spirit behind it? And so often in Scripture we read, this is that. And my feeling is this is that spirit of Antichrist which is at large, let loose in full force in our world and in our universities. And why it should be, we can figure out in about 2 seconds flat, that it should take the shape of students being radicalized about the Palestinian cause. And anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic, anti-Israel. It doesn't take a lot of figuring out to see what's going on, and I think it's deeply, deeply disturbing. And I think one of the things that really does freak me out a lot is that there seems to be a reluctance to actually figure out and to take into account what happened on that terrible day, on that massacre, and how it was carried out and what happened. And for them, i.e. the students that you refer to in this poll, how they can think that this is acceptable as a reaction, I simply do not know, except that we do know that it's deeply spiritual and that it is done by the enemy, by an enemy, by the enemy. And we have got to pray, and pray as never before.
Absolutely, that's why it's good to have two intercessors on the programme. And Sarah, for example, according to the Daily Mail, who ran with this survey that was commissioned by StandWithUS, which is the pro-Israel educational organisation that works on university campuses, equipping and educating particularly Jewish students so that they can make a stand for Israel and the Jewish people on campus. According to the Daily Mail, they said that almost 40% of students at the Russell Group universities believe that October the 7th attacks on Israel were understandable acts of resistance. A poll of university students by StandWithUS also found out that a third considered the Hamas massacre that sparked the new war region as not a terrorist attack. Now that's a huge percentage, 40% are out of 1,000 students questioned on this. And when you consider what Hamas did on October the 7th, the massacre, the biggest massacre of Jewish people since the Holocaust, the massive rapes, the mutilations that took place, the burning of people in cars and killing people in cold blood, as well as killing dogs and animals. Just share with us how our students, this one, have got it so wrong and how they've been so radicalized with this hatred and indoctrination against Israel and the Jewish people, that they share these deeply disturbing views.
I think the root of it is absolutely spiritual. But I also think it has to do with education. If you look back, some people compare this to the move in the 1960s against the Vietnam War in the States and make love, not war. The fundamental difference here is that they've been taught since history, high school history, to hate themselves, to hate their culture, to hate Britain or America, and to want to disturb and even overturn the government. And recently, I watched on another channel an interview between Suella Braverman and one student. All the students, she went to Cambridge, her alma mater, to speak to students. They all blanked her. It's not that they pretended they didn't see her. They stared at her and wouldn't talk to her. But 2 students volunteered, okay, we'll go in the studio. So they chose one of the 2. And what came out of that interview was a very, very interesting interview, but what came out was actually they want to destroy the government. They also want Palestine to prevail, but they don't understand what Palestine is. So too much slanted history of British history stay here, and not enough real history in terms of the Jewish situation and the situation in what was once the British Mandate of Palestine. But if you look at Melanie Phillips, for example, she has said, when we teach the Holocaust, we've not done it properly, we've not done it thoroughly. So they teach it in a vacuum, but you need to give the full history, you need to give the whole dimension. And the other thing, which you didn't ask me, is in order to turn these students, I think, sadly, they need to see some of the footage that the broadcasters saw voluntarily, some of the politicians saw voluntarily. Some of these young people, as horrific as it is to say, they need to see the footage.
I've seen it at the Israeli embassy, and it's like a horror film, but worse than a horror film. It's absolutely, truly shocking. The images and the videos you see and stuff as well, and it does leave a footprint of the evil that happened on October the 7th in Israel. And then visiting the sites of the kibbutzes that were destroyed and seeing the cars that were shot up on October the 7th, you just then begin to understand the sheer magnitude of what actually happened. And yeah, they need to see it, but it will have a deeply profound psychological impact on them if they do. And I think Israel is wanting to protect particularly this young generation from that. But yeah, you're right, that they need to see it. And Olive, I mean, like, for example, you can understand protests against war. You can understand, for example, however, I don't believe it's correct, but we live in a democracy, and you know, you have the right to protest as part of our democratic institutions in this country and as part of our democratic traditions. But to actually sympathize with a globalist Islamist terror organization like Hamas, that in their covenant charter want to destroy not only Israel but the Jewish people around the world, and the slaughter of over 1,200 Israelis on October the 7th and foreigners, plus taking 250 hostages back to Gaza, and about 100 are believed to be left in the Hamas terror tunnels. Combine this with over 6,000 injured and the sheer scale of the horrors that took place, the rapes, the mutilations, the torture, crimes against humanity. Surely British students do not want to align themselves with the evil that is with Hamas. What do you think is influencing them to support a terror organization like Hamas against Israel?
I think in some peculiar way, in a very twisted way, a sadistic way, that there is some kind of status in supporting the Palestinian cause, and the reverse. There is status in being anti-Israel and anti-Jewish. But one of the things that I simply do not understand, and it's very difficult to comprehend, is that the reading up of what actually happened during that attack, including women being shot through their private parts into their stomachs with guns, and the most utterly horrendous crimes. And does this mean to say that none of these students has actually bothered to read up or even watch or see what happened that day? I mean, it's a hugely emotional response. Yes, of course, one can see that the attacks against Gaza by the Israelis, that has somehow clicked something in their brain to call it genocide, which it isn't, but nevertheless, horrific number of casualties of the bombing of, and fighting in Gaza itself. So what I think is happening is, well, it's all kinds of things. It's also a kind of a bloodlust. And I think that this is something which, for young students, and, they're all kind of gung-ho about what's happening in Gaza. It just clouds their understanding, clouds their thinking, and one wonders how on earth one can begin to redress this in any way, to understand that what has happened from the Israeli side in response to what happened on October the 7th, that is something which they are going to have to take into account, because you can't just look at the situation just in one isolated way. And it's completely, utterly unacceptable, horrific, dreadful, ghastly. We've got to do, I don't know exactly what the universities can do or the parliamentarians can do, because you're talking about changing people's minds, and that's a very big thing. But hey, we have the power of prayer, do we not? And we carry on, and it's wonderful that you do the work that you do, that you're involved with, because it is only through prayer that anything of any sort is going to actually come to pass.
Yeah, Olave, you're making a very interesting point there. The point that you make, which is really profound, is the fact that for Generation Z and our university students, there isn't that individual critical thinking. It's collective thinking. Yeah. So therefore, we think as mass, we think as one, we don't analyse, we don't question, like your generations would have done before at university, where you were told to be a critical thinker and an independent thinker. I think this generation of students are told collectively how they should think, and no one thinks really much outside of the box, unless you're directly affected like the like Jewish or Israeli students on campus. Sarah, we're also living in this horrific climate of Jew hatred campuses, where we've seen literally Jewish students in fear after the horrors of October the 7th. Many Israeli and Jewish students are kind of fearing for their own safety, where Jewish students are intimidated because they're Jewish, even though they have maybe even no connection with Israel. They are still being blamed for the actions of the Israeli government. According to the same article in the Daily Mail, they report that the rise of anti-Semitism on university campuses across the UK is unprecedented, and that the Union of Jewish Students has said that there's been over 700 calls about anti-Semitism from frightened students since October the 7th. They're warning that they are terrified and also being targeted on campus. What does that tell us about our society and how our university have become breeding grounds for extremism, where we're seeing that Jewish people are being singled out?
Our society's become very weak, 100%. The police are not policing. They're arresting people for praying, or I saw a clip yesterday online a man was street preaching and they took the Bible away, and he said, "Please don't take my Bible." And he said, "You should have thought of that before you started," what did he say? Hate speech. So the lack of critical thinking, as you've both referred to, is a fundamental problem. Police are not thinking. The university professors, either they've stopped thinking or they're just carrying on indoctrinating. But this this lack of thought, and of course, Jewish university students will be bright and capable, just like any university student would be or should be, but they will not be indoctrinated, they will not be consumed by this spirit of Antichrist, this anti-Semitic spirit. So they're thinking through things, they can see. But the irony is, what it was 5-10 years ago, they started having safe spaces for students that found things difficult. Now, the victims needing the safe spaces are now the aggressors, and there's no safe spaces for the Jewish people.
It's tragic. And Olive, we are facing a very dangerous situation because it all starts at our universities. It is the breeding ground for extremism, for Jew hatred, and we saw that in the 1930s where Nazism really took root at the universities across Germany, and then of course led to the rise of the Nazis. Now we know that any ideology where its core ideology is Jew hatred, then we know that we're in serious trouble. I can also see a lot of parallels between the times we're living in now and the rise of Nazism with this coalition of the hard left and Islamists. Share with us how have we actually lost the lessons of the Holocaust? Have we forgotten the horrors of what happened during the Second World War? And our nation, our government seems to be absolutely incapable of confronting this hatred.
Well, don't forget that the generation of students that we're talking about, they were not even in existence at the time or at the end of the Second World War. So that they know about the Second World War, you can see pictures and etc., news footage and everything else, but the actual impact, the real punch of it is not there as it would be for the generation who actually were alive at that time. And so that their thinking now is, it's not in a sort of it's not in a bubble exactly, because we're influenced by events that happen all around us all the time. But the thing is that there isn't, as you were saying, there isn't this critical thinking about, okay, so what's going on? What is behind this incredible anti-Semitic move and the hatred of the Jews? And how do you stop it? It's very difficult without the thought police to affect the way that people think. And when you see this happening on our university campuses now, you know, it would be very nice in some kind of brave new world if you could send out the thought police, but you can't. And this is the problem that we have, is how you actually influence how people think, how they feel, how they perceive things that are going on is so important. And there is a kind of an intellectual snobbery, I suppose, in a way. It's all kind of put onto a very high intellectual plane, but that's not where it should be. Okay, yes, you can analyze, should be able to analyze, but it's a question of the heart. It's a question of the spirit. And this is so difficult to pin down. And how is this going to be counteracted? And this is a very, very important aspect of what we're thinking about today. We need to think about it. When, you know, how on earth you go about it is quite another thing. But, as I've said before, prayer and more prayer, and people speaking out. I think one of the things that is terribly bad at the moment, is that even if you were to vaguely suggest that you are pro-Israel in some way, or pro-God's covenant people, that you're likely to come under attack yourself. So that it's not just the students, it's also the adults, it's also the universities, professors, it's everybody else. So you have to be kind of fashionable in what you're thinking and the causes that you espouse.
Absolutely. And I suppose the key thing to what you've just said there is that people have lost their moral compass. They no longer know the difference between right and wrong because we have moved so far away from our Judeo-Christian heritage. And when it comes to the influence of young people, we're seeing, particularly with Generation Z, that TikTok is the main influence. These very short, few seconds video clips where we're seeing it's used as a weapon to influence young people regarding the conflict in Gaza. And of course, this is poisoning their hearts and their minds, and also breeding ground for extremism on our universities. Just share with us how this is the next generation of leaders that have been indoctrinated with hatred and Jew hatred, and where this could possibly lead us once these young people get into positions of power and influence in anything between 10 and 20 years' time.
Well, I think we need to look at motive. So let's assume they mean well. Let's assume they think that vengeance against this horrific organization, country, whatever you want to call Israel and the Jewish people. Let's, from their perspective, they're evil because they have done this horrible thing in Gaza. They have taken away the Palestinians' homeland. None of it's based on fact. You don't look at the facts. But let's assume that their motive is they want to protect. They want what is right to happen. Then we start with that and say, okay, if that's what you want, now let's look at the facts and start with the Palestinian rather than the Jewish, rather than defending the Jews, explaining in some measure the Palestinian roots, meaning the word Palestine and the British Mandate, and that it was full of Jews and Arabs as well, and cut through, try to, in an intellectual way, try to give them facts based on their initial premise, and to try to deal with it that way. But otherwise, other than shock and horror, I don't know what else you can do. Because if they don't learn the reality, and if they do run for office, then we're going to have a very difficult time in 10, 20, 30 years' time. The roots of anti-Semitism are the same as the roots of Antichrist, are the same as the roots of evil. And if they think that what their cause is good, then we need to re-educate, redefine what is good and evil for them, but come from where they are rather than where we are, because we can't pull them in. There is one solution, and there is only one solution ultimately, and that's Jesus. That is love, because love is stronger than hate. Love is stronger than fear. But other than that, there is no real breakthrough.
Absolutely. And Olive, the Education Secretary, Gillian Keegan, has actually stressed that Jewish students must be protected and welcomed at British universities. But is this enough? Because we know that, for example, universities, and having gone to university, it's a wonderful opportunity to learn and to get a discipline, but also prepares you for kind of life as well. And what kind of academic freedom of expression would we have if Jewish students are not able to participate at our universities? The alternative views are closed down, and there's only the one collective mindset or ideology that is able to be prevalent at our universities. Isn't this that we're heading down a very authoritarian and dangerous path if our universities continue to put pressure on Jewish students at campus?
Of course, of course. I mean, if you think about it, how would Jewish students be protected? I mean, just take a hypothetical situation. How would you identify the Jewish students in order that they may be protected? And you sort of think of Star of David and all kinds of things like that, in the rise of Nazism. And it's so utterly, I mean, they don't look any different. They look the same as everybody else. So how would you know? How would the authorities know? How would the police know? How would you actually set about giving some kind of protection in the context, say, of student demonstrations and protests, in the public square? It's, we have to think about that, because they do need protection. But how?
A good question. Sarah, we're down to the last 3 minutes of the programme. So how would you recommend our viewers watching this programme, A, to respond to what's happening at our universities, especially like yourself, having their sons or daughters at our universities, knowing that Jewish students feel threatened, knowing that our universities have been taken over by extremists who not only want to destroy Israel and attack the Jewish people, but essentially hate the West and want to see the downfall of the West?
I think the Christian unions and the churches in the university towns need to embrace, not to try to convert. Jesus will do that if he wants to, but to embrace the Jewish people and say, this is a safe place. Welcome them, come alongside them. I'm speaking of my son and others, welcome them, be aware. We have Jewish friends, and we've seen that at university, and we've seen that they are moving from clearly standing for their rights to quietly standing for their rights. It's a very difficult situation. We just need to encourage them.
Absolutely. And you mentioned that prayer is the key. Do you think that Christians have lost sight of the need to pray for our academic institutions, our professors and our universities, and knowing that this is now the new battleground against extremism, a new battleground where we're seeing this hatred emerge against Israel and the Jewish people, and some of these dangerous ideologies are literally emerging from our universities?
Well, yes. Again, how on earth do you control people's thinking, and how do you control their ideology? You can't control it. But I mean, what you are saying about the student unions, that anywhere there is a kind of a coming together of student bodies, well, you'll have to get some people to stand up on their hand lugs and say some things, very, very much so, and loud and strong. Now, whether the universities themselves are prepared to do that is another thing. Because you know what? I think scared. So once you start on that route, oh boy, then the hatred is turned upon them, and that is a very difficult thing to control. But hey, listen, we are in a very, very serious situation indeed, and we have to take note of it, and we have to do something about it.
So Olave and Sarah, thank you so much for being my guest on this week's edition of Politics Today. And I want to thank you for watching this programme at home. If you are a Christian on campus, please befriend Jewish students. Please comfort them and say they're not alone. But also we need to pray for our universities, and we need to stand up to the hatred that we're seeing and the extremism on campus, because after all, this generation at university now will be our leaders and of this country in 10 to 20 years' time. So the future matters. So well, thank you for watching this week's edition of Politics Today.